Talk about the game some more.
Yeah, why don't you?
All in, but seating.
Okay.
Were you at the game yesterday?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Oh, you go.
Right.
You go to the games.
Oh yeah, I let my kids go when we play Harvard, but I go. I need to be there for the big ones. I can't let Duke go with just the kids to support them.
So you think they're better this year than they were last year? Or?
Yeah, if they'll stay healthy. Yeah. No question about it. It's the fastest Duke team I've ever seen. Just incredible speed.
Best athletes I've seen in a while.
Yeah, really are amazing.
How do y'all account for the fact that Wake Forest beat them so easily?
People were hurt.
Oh, asleep. Oh, they were asleep.
Did you go to Wake?
No, Carolina.
Did you? Where's that?
It's somewhere around here, I think. I haven't been there in a while.
All right.
You ready to go?
Yeah. First thing I want to do is this is an interview with George Autry, March 9th, 1992, in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, by Bob Korstead and Neil Boothby. George, why don't you talk a little bit about your background, where you grew up, your family, something about what they did, and your childhood.
Well, I grew up in Wilmington, North Carolina, down on the southeast coast, in the middle class, but I was sort of a half-breed. I was half Yankee, half Southerner. My mother's family were from Ohio, and that was the middle class branch. And my father's family was from, a town 3 or 4 miles outside a town named Clement. And Clement's about 9.5 miles from Autryville. I mean, if you still need some geographic help, Autryville's somewhere between Clinton and Fayetteville, meaning this is really a long way from anything. And although I grew up middle class, the family farm where my grandparents lived until the 40s, and after they died, my maiden aunt lived until the year before last when she died at 96. I mean, I remember when we first got hot and cold water instead of the well water there, and I remember when we moved the bathroom indoors, and I remember when the lights came to. I know something about the rural South, and I suppose although they call themselves poor, that branch of my family, by the standards of the day, even they weren't poor. They owned that plot of land and had for the last 100 years that they scratched out a living on. But I grew up in public schools and went off to Duke and never applied to any other school but Duke in Carolina, the first in my family to go off to college. My father was the first to graduate from high school in the family, and that was when he was 22 years old. It took him that long, dropping out of school and working, going back into school. And his father was the first to be able to read and write. So it's a generation.
Strange progression here.
Yeah, strange progression.
When did he move into? What brought him off the land into town, into Wilmington?
He just, by the time he had graduated from high school, he absolutely despised farm work. He hated it and swore he'd never do it again. He was accepted to Carolina, but it was going to be it would take another 6 or 7 years of dropping in and out of school to work to save the money, and he decided not to, so he worked himself went over to Fayetteville first, which was not too far away, and worked for a while, and then headed for the big city of Wilmington to find his fame and fortune and my mother.
When you were growing up and going through school and everything, what were, just trying to think, some of the people who were had the greatest impact or influence on you that helped you develop your sense of values and an ethical sense?
Oh, I would suppose my parents, who for their time were clearly not racist, probably wouldn't even be called racist by today's standards. We're not much concerned about segregation. We're very concerned about decency and that sort of thing, so that I felt I was the only kid in my neighborhood for whom Joe Louis was a hero. And I couldn't understand why the other white kids. I mean, I grew up without a real good understanding of the visceral racism of the South, so that although I suppose I didn't pay much attention to it, there was a lot of, at that time though, a lot of commingling with black kids that we played together. I mean, every year we had something called the Salt and Pepper Bowl over Thanksgiving, where the kids from the black high school and the kids from the white high school would get together and play. I had older black friends, so, and I mentioned that when you talk about what has a influence. I mean, the defining issue of my life was not Vietnam, but before that was the Civil Rights Movement. And so that's the most interesting thing and the most relevant thing, really, to what we're talking about here today. At MDC is really race. I remember in the '54 Supreme Court decision and being confused by it. On the one hand, things had always been this way, so why should they go against precedent and overturn it? On the other hand, how in the world could we ever find ourselves in this position in the first place? It seemed a logical bind, but it wasn't until after I'd been at Duke for a couple or 3 years that I came to a stronger and stronger feeling about a basically evil system. Interesting, you know, at a part of that, I had always been interested in public policy and inveterate newspaper reader. I'm a newspaper buff, but did a undergraduate paper at Duke for a political science course on why Sampson County was more Republicans than Democrats. It was the only county in eastern North Carolina with a strong Republican. And background, and I looked at it, and in my family, this poor family I was talking about, most of them were Republicans. There were some Democrats, but what had happened was that in the populist movement in the late 1880s, when poor whites had an election stolen from them statewide by the Democratic Party, the populist party was so angry in some places at the Democrats that they joined the Republican Party, what was left of Reconstruction Party, and that was the source of my Republican roots on that side of my family. But when I confronted my family with this, they just absolutely wouldn't believe it. I mean, we're Republicans because that's the way God meant us to be. I mean, just like we're Baptist and Methodist, right? I mean, you're marked when you're born, and that's the right thing to do. Fascinating little side issue.
What about Duke? That must have been a very different world from public schools of Wilmington to.
Oh yeah, I mean it really was. I mean going up there, Duke was still was even then as much a northeastern school as it was a North Carolina school, and to be thrown into that much more heterogeneous milieu was a shock, and I was immediately homesick for either Wilmington or UNC over at Chapel Hill. But of course, I learned an extraordinary amount from it, and was always in the debates over usually race. By the time 7 years later, when I left law school, I was probably more remembered for leading campaigns to integrate the law school than I was for anything that had to do with my academic record.
George, I had a question. Just go back a little bit to your earlier life before we go on with the university. I'm curious about farm values. Have they had an impact on your life? Have they helped you imagine what one needs to do in today's world?
You say farm or?
Farm values that one learns on a farm.
from the
So
agriculture.
you did grow up on a farm. You talked about the farm being very present still in your life and your father's.
Oh yeah, I should say that I own that farm, on which I lose money, of course, every year, because to hold it together from the 6 people who would have inherited it from my aunt, I had to buy it from the 6 of them, so I've got a mortgage on that, and I don't make a lot of money. So yeah, obviously, and another anecdote along that line. My aunt owned 2 farms when she died. From each side, the very poor part of the family, which was the Autry part, and in the slightly more well-to-do side of the family, which was the Culberth side. And on the Autry side that I bought to hold that farm together, there were 6 graves, and for my great-grandfather and mother and 3 of their children who had died, and these graves were marked with a pine knot, really out in the woods, now completely grown over. And when my aunt, the 96-year-old aunt, inherited a little bit of money from her sister when her sister died, my aunt then being about 85, she decided we were going to put stone markers there. And so we did. We cleared it and put stone markers up and put a little pipe fence around it. So, you know what? An incident like that is just sort of a dramatic evocation that even those of us who were 2 or 3 generations removed from the land still feel a part of those ever-present fundamental values of thrift and caring and family, and something I suppose that I would tend to say separates the Southern novel from American literature at large more than anything else. It's very hard to describe, or Faulkner or Eudora Welty would have done it.
What did Duke do? I assume that you were. What was one of the first things? What was the political climate about race like at Duke in the 50s when you were a student and when you were law school?
It was a roaring intellectual debate, obviously. There was very little of mixing in commerce between the races. The big event which the state of North Carolina allowed the 2 races to get together was something called State Student Legislature, which I suppose still exists, and it was held over in the Capitol, and the students of all of the universities in the state would elect delegates to this legislature. And it was there that I met and became friends at the time with a couple at NCCU. But when that couple and my gal, who is now my wife, wanted to get together for a picnic, they couldn't get permission from NCCU that we could even go out together to a public park or to Duke Forest. Now, of course, it was fine with Duke, and Duke was somewhat integrated at the time. Duke probably would have been integrated, ironically, if court decisions didn't come down when they did come down, which stiffened resistance on the Board of Trustees every time the Supreme Court would make a due decision.
What about influences there on you, or people who stand out as kind of guiding you through those 7 years, or who you, in your kind of present career and life, would look back on as?
Well, too, from a public policy standpoint, Dr. Rankin, who was chairman of the Political Science Department, a member of and a charter member of the Civil Rights Commission, the United States Civil Rights Commission, and Douglas Maggs, the constitutional law authority at Duke, who was nationally known, and both of them very progressive. Rankin on the one hand, a good old Southern boy who had studied at Princeton, and Maggs on the other hand, who was certainly radical for his time, and a brilliant intellect. And those two, I would say. I mean, there are others like Joel Colton who challenged as a freshman my feelings on race when I had a more benign look at segregation and what the consequences of segregation might be. That whole challenging atmosphere, while I was there. But I would say those are the two.
And then you go off to Washington.
Yeah, I got a fellowship out of law school to study with any North Carolina representative or senator I wished for a year. And it was a really healthy stipend, which was nice. And because I was absolutely, centrally interested in constitutional law and what it could do, I chose Sam Ervin after a great crisis of conscience because of Ervin's opposition to civil rights. But he clearly was the best constitutional lawyer in the Senate, and was a civil liberties liberal, it was after praying over this with Maggs that I decided to go where I was going. And I went to a subcommittee on constitutional rights rather than directly to Senator Ervin's office, which assuaged my conscience somewhat because Ervin was nothing if not fair. He was not one of those senators who would bottle things up in committee. He wanted the staff to serve everybody, and of course we had a diverse people on our. And of course I came to love Ervin and stayed on for years after that. I did a good PBS thing, by the way, on his life last year that would be interesting.
What was your experience in Washington working in that kind of policy process from a legislative point of view? And you were there when so many of the important pieces of
all of the civil
social
rights
and economic legislation of this decade, of this century, were being hammered out. And, one of the things we're interested in is looking at the differences in the policy process from the legislative branch and executive down to grassroots levels, nonprofits. And I guess maybe you could talk a little bit about how that whole process worked from your point of view, or what were the fundamental issues? Was there how aware were the representatives and the senators of the real problems that they were trying to address with Civil Rights Act and other pieces of legislation?
Oh, I think the white people of the South had generally fooled themselves about the nature of segregation and its consequences, and I think their representatives in Washington pretty much reflected their views over the years. I'm answering the last question to a long series of questions, though. I should add a couple of things. I think I had been involved briefly in the beginning of the sit-ins in Durham, which occurred right after those in Greensboro, and I got out of them rather quickly, my wife and I, because Judge Green, who's Superior Court Judge, black Superior Court Judge today over in Raleigh, probably wouldn't remember me at all, told me that I shouldn't get anybody who was going to be a lawyer, should not get involved in those because we'd never pass the bar in his law students. And I didn't. And I never know whether I would have had the courage to go off on those freedom rides, which came a little bit later, or not. And I really doubt it. But it was interesting that was the frame of mind I hit Washington in. And the second thing was that my wife, who had been at Duke, graduated. We got married about 3 days after I graduated from law school, and she's from undergraduate school. Went to work for Hubert Humphrey in Washington, and she worked for then Senator and later Vice President Humphreys for 7 years while I was working for Ervin. Their offices were close together. And Humphrey was the floor leader for most of the Civil Rights Bill. And we were really involved in that. And since I had the responsibility for helping out Senator Javits as much as I did Senator Eastland, I was writing speeches all over the place. I suppose being what I'd been trained to be, which is for which there are not a lot of jobs. I was a constitutional lawyer doing whatever was handed me, and it was a fascinating time. And nothing will ever be, I don't suppose, as exciting a time as that was. But that was only a 25% of the work, and 75% of the work I was involved in were civil liberties, constitutional rights of American Indians, wiretapping, no-knock as it was called back then, breaking and entering by the cops, in effect. The constitutional rights of the mentally ill, whole series of civil liberties issues that took up more of our time.
Have to change this every 20 minutes.
That's fine. I may not last this whole session with this coat on. I may have to go to the Carolina.
I think you can take it off anytime you want. If we need to open the window, well, that'll mess your sound up, I guess. You want to take it off now? It's
I think I will. It really is. Thank you, sir. I saw Becky last week, y'all. Becky Reimel.
Oh, you did?
She says she's coming. And I talked to Betsy Campbell at Ford, who says she's coming.
Yeah, I've got to send her a letter. Right. I meant to.
There versus sort of the nonprofit thing you're doing now, trying to bring these coalitions together. What kind of in retrospect is that exciting time? But
it was an exciting time, but it was getting old. I mean, because what we were doing was stop government from doing things to people, which government is always want to do. The fascinating thing was I was working for Urban, who was a genius at stopping government from doing unto the people, while Humphrey was, I think, of our generation, the most creative legislator I have seen in getting government to do for people. Medicare, the Peace Corps, I mean, almost the Civil Rights Bill, almost every piece of important legislation of that time was at Humphrey's hands. So it was fun, but a subcommittee chief counsel it's a great place for a big ego, because you can hammer away at bureaucrats, and you can cross-examine folks from all over the country, and you can pound the table, and you can demand service for constituents. But after a while, there's only so much you can do. And to answer this question and an earlier question, I don't think Congress has much of an idea about what the sweeping issues and how they affect people. I don't suppose they can. Ours isn't that's democracy is a terribly inefficient form of government anyway. But you can only be expert in one or two narrow issues, and I'm sure there are a few congressmen who understand rural poverty. There are a few congresswomen who understand the problems of poor women in the big cities, and there are others who understand the problems of the farmer. There are probably not a whole lot of people that understand up there that understand that the rural South is unrelated to agricultural legislation and the commodity bill. I mean, we are a great, despite being a rural state and an agricultural state, we pay out, not get back money. We pay out for those commodity programs that serve the Midwest. So I was getting awfully restless doing the same thing every year when I was recruited, actually, by the North Carolina Fund to come back in.
Why don't you, how did MDC get started? Who were some of the important people and kind of imagining this organization and its role?
George Esser, number one, who was the executive director of the North Carolina Fund, one of the country's first poverty-fighting programs and a statewide one. Terry Sanford, Luther Hodges Jr., who was a member of the board of the fund and the first chairman of this organization. Martha McKay, who had assistant president of the fund and was my first assistant president at MDC, had put together a proposal and taken it to the National Association of Manufacturers and the Office of Economic Opportunity, which is the first and last time those two organizations ever got together. They didn't stay together long, but the fact that this was the founding partnership did give something of a challenge, I would think, to George Esser, and I assume they came after me because they figured that any boy who could work for Sam Irvin and find happiness with a girl that worked for Hubert Humphrey ought to be able to keep NAM and OEO in bed together. I couldn't, of course, but I had no other qualifications. I was not an economist. I had been a politician. I was president of Duke Young Democrats in 1960, which is of no consequence except that the Democratic Party in Durham County in 1960 decided they weren't going to support Kennedy, which meant that it fell on this sort of strange structure to run the presidential campaign. And I had been heavily involved in Democratic politics in '64. I'd been an advance man for Lyndon Johnson, for Lady Bird, for Humphrey. So I think they thought a politician, but not a partisan politician, was more at this stage of the anti-poverty movement, when it was just being discovered, I think, generally, that you couldn't create jobs for people without the participation of the private sector in the effort, and that you couldn't lift people from poverty by giving them a board of their peers and a pot of federal money and say, go do it, which was, in a sense, partly what was an oversimplification of what was happening at the time. It meant somebody to take MDC's reins who could communicate with a broad cross-section of North Carolinians and was committed to social progress, but more committed to getting it done than having revenge. Or
what were some of the larger, say, social and economic problems that MDC was trying to address?
It was, in thinking in general, the country was generally involved in a period of total chaos. It had lost its moral way in Vietnam. We had lost our intellectual way often in the South with some of the things that were going on at the time. There were riots in the cities, and yet at the same time this was an era of chaos. It was also a time when it seemed that all things were possible. Ergo, such partnerships as NAM and OEO. But for us, given that was just the backdrop, given what we were to contend with, we in North Carolina had not gone or about to go through what Mississippi and Tennessee, Arkansas had gone through with cotton mechanization and the greatest migration in the history of North America. And that millions of our poor folks left the farms for the cities of the North. And this was still happening in North Carolina. And it was happening at a time when North Carolina companies, fueled by the heat of the Vietnam War economy, were requiring more and more workers. And at the same time, that integration of the workforce was finally occurring on a relatively massive scale. It had been required by federal law 3 years before, but it was really being implemented just about the time. So you had the two twin phenomena of transformation of agriculture to manufacturing, and from a segregated to an integrated workforce, and that was what we were created to contend with.
What kind of those are kind of broad problems. What's kind of specific problems, say, in terms of individuals or institutions, were you trying to address in these early, say, in this early phase of NBC's history?
The two transformations left us with fundamental mismatches in the labor force and the economy. And so it required addressing at various levels, at a lot more levels probably than we tried to address it. But number one, the question was how you were going to teach people who had worked hard all their lives in the fields to work according to the clock instead of according to the sun. I mean, it really is a fundamental difference. And why you have to work on the opening day of deer season and when it's raining, but you don't necessarily have to work 14 hours, the rest of the days of the week. It's a fundamentally different culture. It's a different era and a different age. It's not the private enterprise system that we're talking about in American textbooks. The system of agriculture which produced these people is an outgrowth of slavery and what's left of a feudal society which was going on at the time. And black folks to whom employment in any meaningful industry had been denied forever were asked to come in and work with white people and managers who had been used to working with the products of white working class high school graduates for the most part, or for a large part. So programs first, we went out programs first to help people make the transition. And the HRD program, which is in 48 or so community colleges today, is I'm sure trained a minimum of 80,000 by now. Train people from agriculture to manufacturing and from dependency of the sort that the sharecropping and tenant farm system imposed, a dependency that required work of you, but nevertheless you were dependent on what a century before had been an owner and now still was an owner of the means of production to a large extent. Now, how to make that transition is more complicated, I think, than most of us liberals at the time would have thought until you got plunged in and got to working with it. And then we experimented heavily with a program called, which part of one experiment as part of a larger national experiment of changing migration patterns by trying to bring people to High Point, Greensboro, Charlotte, who had been going to Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, and from Appalachia to Chicago and Detroit, and bringing them instead where they were needed here. And then programs which were almost demanded by industry and by the people we had trained for get first-line supervisors and top-level management to understand what it is to manage individual differences. Basically, it's good management, but first you got to confront, of course, the inherent racism that these folks have been cursed with.
George, earlier, I think in a very sort of modest way, you sort of said, I don't know why I was chosen for this job. I wasn't an economist. But my question is, I listened to you, how much of this era dealt with sort of more technical questions that perhaps economists would be useful for versus fundamental questions of fairness and equity and how do you include people that have been excluded historically?
Yeah, I mean, maybe an undue modesty, but I really think, there was a requirement by people of the same values that I have that these values be represented at the organizational level, but what they were really looking for was somebody who could cajole, convince people to work together toward a larger fundamental goal of a better economy and a healthier economy with less poverty. Obviously, George and other people knew the economic argument, and not just the equity argument, for educating and training and finding jobs for people, because those that you don't find a job for are an inherent threat to the society, to the economy, were then or now. And also it did fit with my own rather routine Protestant upbringing that work ought to be the antidote to poverty. I mean, it wasn't in the rural South, where 75% of us worked, where every man, woman, child, jack of us worked, and 75% at least were poor. But we were entering into a kind of economy where that would not have to be anymore. That if you could give the people the tools to compete in the primary labor market, that they could overcome poverty.
A follow-up question to that: at this particular point in time, as you left government and sort of entered this nonprofit, private nonprofit, so to speak, was kind of in retrospect, was that the way to do it at that time, sort of out of a nonprofit sphere? Or what could a nonprofit entity offer up in terms of vision, direction, leadership, connections that government, perhaps on the one hand, couldn't do, and or business, perhaps on the other hand, either could or couldn't do?
I think it was becoming clear to people like George Esser then, and certainly to me, who had been trying to deal with the inefficiency and the fatuous, bloated government that was in Washington at the time, that innovation is not likely to come from government in the first place. I mean, the incentives are there for innovation in the private sector. I mean, that's what profit does. It requires it encourages efficiency, and it encourages change and innovation. But the incentives in the public sector are turf protection, budget protection, and to some extent service to people. And that is the opposite. Trouble with the for-profit sector is that one of the fairly few failures of capitalism has been its failure to overcome poverty. Obviously, that has to be targeted. Efforts have to be targeted. And I think, if not in 1967, certainly now when the government is broke anyway, it's clear that if we're going to solve these problems, the ideas, the creativity, the generation have to come from the nonprofit sector.
I have a different question that pertains to...
Wait, you still get some squeaking out here in the hallway. I'm not sure what it is.
Shut up, Nova.
Did you know that by this time in your life, you sort of left Washington and you entered this? Did you know that was the better way to go at this point in time?
I suspected that it was. I think George probably... Y'all were going to interview George Esser.
Yeah.
It's the air conditioner that's squeaking? How about I was really getting down on Washington, on the answers coming out of Washington. And in policy, I've never been often at odds with my liberal friends who think that wisdom ought to reside on the banks of the Potomac, even if it doesn't, and that the states are somehow fundamentally flawed when it comes to... I think state government is... You can make state government work, and probably ought to demand that it has. But at the time, it seemed to me that in 1967 there was a lot of evidence that we needed a new route, and I suspected it. I think now it's fairly clear.
The question I had was this process of industrialization, urbanization, that different ways that you're trying to address, been going on for 60, 70, 100, almost 100 years in North Carolina. Um, you know, employers and employees have had the same kind of problem. You know, generation of people going to generations of people going to work in the textile factory and stuff. Did you have any sense of that history or an appreciation of that when you were trying to address these kinds of concerns at that point? Did you go back and kind of look at studies of the rise of the textile mills and the rise of a working class in the South to think about how you might solve some of those problems?
In my case, yeah, I was fairly aware of it because, I mean, you have to realize that for most of my life since early adolescence, I've been a Southern political and economic policy wonk, so that I was aware of a lot of the literature. What difference that made, the extent of it when you plunge in and then try to iron it out, because we were working at a very applied level. So it had value free for the most part. We were working under the presumption that putting people into good jobs that paid fairly well just made a lot of sense for the economy and for people, and if you could do that, then all of the other poverty issues with which we were not concerned, legal services or housing or medical care, all those other legitimate issues, we just could take care of themselves in another frame of reference. I'd say generally I happen to be, but and it probably prevented us from making a lot of mistakes, a lot more than everything we did was not successful, I should hasten to add. We came in at the early age of computers, and one of our first efforts would try to match up the unemployed and underemployed by the job openings using computer technology, and it didn't much work. We tried a lot of things, but a lot of what we tried did work, and probably the important thing about what you're doing today is keeping the institutional memory alive in some fashion or another for programs and policies and intervention strategies that have worked in the past, because we lost a lot of that, and from one era to another. Americans have a short attention span and a short patience span for any policy options, and we're dealing with one hula hoop after another. I mean, it's incubators one year, and it's strategic planning the next year, and the following year, what is it today? Apprenticeship for youth. I mean, programmatic responses that are in themselves can help with a piece of the problem, and we think that's going to bring us revolution. So trying to keep alive then what we learn, so when the cycle turns again and incubators are back or micro enterprise or whatever, is we maybe get it right this time.
How was MDC affected by the declining interest in the South and poverty in blacks in rural America that took place in the early 70s? I mean, it was a focus of a lot of policy attention and media attention in the 60s, and by the late 60s, the cities had become really the focal points of social policy.
Right. It drove us more and more to become the rural policy experts, or the keeper of the rural poverty conscience would probably be a better way to say it. I remember in 1973, of course, what was wrong with most of the employment and training and manpower funds and community action programs at the time were devised really and honed in the House Education and Labor Committee, which was controlled by big city Democratic congressmen, in response to the inner city fires. They were really fire extinguisher programs. And we still have a sizable number of folks we can export and do export anytime federal largesse pours into the cities. Of course, the word is not far behind in the country that come on in, the water's fine. When we made the transition from the Manpower Development Training Act to the Concentrated Employment Training Act in 1973, the bill came out of committee and was on the floor in both the House and Senate with entirely weighted on unemployment rates and population, which is the way the money was going to go. And that is one time when I suppose George Esser was right in going after some political understanding. Because I got a freshman Southerner, one of only two like Andrews on the House side, and Sam Ervin on the Senate side to write Jennings Randolph and explain the fact that this was blatant discrimination against the South. Unemployment was not our problem. Underemployment was our problem. And that the training money that we so badly needed, training and education money, was therefore just going to concentrate in the cities to their detriment and to ours. And the result was that Ervin threatened to filibuster, and Andrews kept throwing monkey wrenches in on the House side, and it kept being closer and closer to adjournment. And if this had happened early in the session, they'd probably killed it. But the result was we got a poverty figure as well as an unemployment figure into the distribution of those funds, which meant that rural areas were somewhat protected, insulated.
Was the passage of CETA important watershed in NDC's history? Did your programs and some of the kind of consulting you did change as a result of that change in federal policy?
What it meant was it took us more away from program design and our research and put us more into technical assistance and monitoring and evaluation, because we were relied upon by the U.S. Department of Labor to a large extent to help them out in something back then that we had become expert at. Problem, though, going back to rural areas for a moment, was even though CETA was now distributed appropriately and evenly throughout the country, the act was still designed for urban areas, and it was never worked as well for rural areas as it did in the cities. And of course, that we can say that as experts have monitored its rise and fall in the 70s. Same thing's true, by the way, of welfare reform, the jobs program, and JTPA.
I wondered maybe if you could describe one of the evaluation programs, or maybe you could take one and, just off the top of your head, and think about how it actually worked, how you actually went out into the field and did what you did, say in that phase of.
All right, let me give you a quick capsule. In 1976, we were increasingly concerned with the problem of youth unemployment, with that piece of the total unemployment problem, because the excuse me, the recession of 1974 was about over. But when that recession receded, there were still high levels of youth unemployment, which ordinarily went up and down. There were with the business cycle. This time, it didn't go down. So Juanita Krebs, who was then vice president at Duke and an economist and a member of the National Commission on Employment Policy, got that commission to ask MDC to do a national conference to see whether we could divine some new approaches to youth unemployment. And so we put together a conference in Atlanta in 76 and invited the best economists and program people in the nation. Andy Young keynote it, and Eli Ginsberg close it, and And we came out with a report that eventually became the Carter administration's youth initiatives, as they were called. Youth entitlement programs, various programs. And then, because we had participated in the design of them, we were asked to monitor those programs, by which we would do a sampling. We would take a sampling of programs around the country, put together a network of field research associates, as we call them, college professors like you folks, and housewives, and retired specialists, and we would gather here, do a research design, spread out over the country, take a look at it, do an analysis of what was going right and what was going wrong, and report back to the Department of Labor. We have also, during this monitoring, worked consistently driving the federal government, the state government, local program operators crazy, forcing them to do evaluation. One of the worst problems of social programs in our ken has been the absence of anybody taking a look at what were the outputs of those. In our own HRD program, for instance, in 68 and 69, we started by keeping records on what happened, where people were before they were brought in, and then where they were 3 months after they graduated, 6 months after they graduated, a year after they graduated, and 2 years after they graduated. And then we put together a formula of how long it took them to pay back to the taxpayer the investment that had been made in them. And economists, as they did, Juanita and others, can take that formula apart because control groups aren't involved, and some of the same nice things that happened to our folks would have happened anyway, of course, by changes in the business cycle. But what this did was, and we refined this into something called the Earn Back program, which I won't attempt to describe here, except to say it's in place in the West Community College program. It's funded today not by how many heads you process through the program, but by how much money and how long they stay on the job the people that you train are doing. And then you compare programs at each one of against community colleges against each other. This kind of evaluation is difficult, but it can be done. Self-evaluation can be done by any program person. It's bureaucrats are generally resistive to it, but the amazing thing is that once they try it, they found out that they're doing a better job than they thought they were doing. They're making a bigger difference than they thought they were doing. But anyway, that was a large part of what we were doing back during those seed era too. And we were also the lonely voice that kept saying, despite the fact that in the 70s, of the millions of people who had left the South in the 50s and 60s, hundreds of thousands of them came back to the rural South in the 70s. And it was an era of rural feel-good nationally that extended on into the early 80s, and we were that lonely voice saying, the sky really is falling, it really is falling. And problems out there are still bad.
I have one other question on this workforce development, which seems to be, what central issue of your work in the 70s. You talk about moving the economically and educationally disadvantaged people out of dependency into a primary labor market. Assuming that there are always going to be the existence of these kind of secondary jobs, or jobs in a secondary labor market, maybe not always, but that still exists. Is the idea in this that in some ways it's somewhat age specific, that if we can give people better educational tools, better training tools at certain stages in their life, we can move them into these better jobs, as opposed to strategies that would change the nature of the kinds of jobs that were available to people in North Carolina?
There are two questions there, and let me try one of them first. I don't think that there is any specific piece of this, of what used to be called the manpower problem, that is a specific. I talked to the editorial board of the Philadelphia Inquirer a year ago, and this was around the time of their Norplant scandal, which you may, when they came out and said we're going to solve the welfare problem by giving Norplant to welfare women. And what had led them to this conclusion was being convinced that, when they're school age, it's too late. Early childhood education is too late. I mean, they've really got to start before the kids are born to break the cycle. And the truth is, I mean, you don't write anybody off except maybe the kids that were raised in the crack houses, and then, what they need is medical care and not employment and training. But there are a different set of interventions that can be made for a lot of different kids, especially in the middle schools. You can, for those who you think don't have a future, you can rescue them a lot in that adolescent period. You can rescue a lot that don't make it through that once they're 24 years old and their hormones chill out and they're ready to settle down. College graduates as well as poor folks, but poor folks in particular at the moment. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things you need to do, like breaking the cycle of intergenerational cycle of illiteracy. Program Bill Friday is led over in Chapel Hill. Extraordinary program. But there are just so many things that need to be done on the supply side of the labor market. Now, my friends and associates, Ray Marshall and former Secretary Brock, their report last year, High Skills or Low Wages, was a sort of response to your question. If we don't give people high skills, we're going to have a low-wage workforce. I think the way things are going in this global economy, we're going to have high skills or no wages. I mean, already you have of the adult males over 24, dropped out of high school. You have a decline in real wages of 41% between 1973 and 1985. I mean, it is a sheer evaporation in the value of their productive capacity. Now, your last part of your question goes to what do you do on the demand side of the equation. I think we are coming into an economy where work increasingly can be an antidote to poverty, but that education is an absolute prerequisite to work. So that supply side piece is terribly important, and you're right, it's the side where we've already done a lot of economic development work, especially in rural areas. The demand side is important as well. But I would ask you, which demand side strategies would you suggest? And I don't mean that facetiously, because what do we do? Do we choose to drive our low-wage industry overseas? I mean, forces are taking it overseas anyway. Forces already, or at least are having it not stop in the South on its way to Mexico, making the jump all the way over. I think that there are things, but I think free trade probably is more important to the South than high tariffs, for instance. And I think, whereas what you do on the supply side is relatively simple to comprehend, I think it gets much more complicated.
Well, that's the real transition that you make that NDC makes in the 80s, is to begin to focus much more concretely on the issues of economic development, how you begin stimulating growth in rural areas, stimulating the kinds of jobs that people are being trained or going to have to be trained to do. How easily was that? Okay, go ahead. That's hot.
Thank you.
Guys,
light's still okay to see you? Neil, it's probably about midway through this tape, or we'll kind of be through, we can kind of get through the issues of the 80s, kind of the history of NDC a little bit, and then you can kind of come in a global perspective. Neil's our international question.
Uh-oh.
Somebody ever? Okay.
I forgot the question.
Well, this in the 80s, I think, in response to a couple different things, you really expanded the focus of your programs in economic development of stimulating jobs in rural areas. Became a kind of second part of what MDC did. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was interesting. In the early 80s, we were doing a fairly small project for the Ford Foundation, in which we were trying to determine the impact of federal policies and programs on women and youth in the rural Southeast, to see if there was any. Of course, we found out there wasn't much, but what we found when we were out there reminded us a lot of the fundamental transition that occurred in the economy in the late 60s when we were created. That once again, fundamental structural change was occurring in the rural South, and this was masked both by general prosperity, especially in the Sun Belt, and we got a grant from the Ford Foundation, a major one this time, to put together a panel of distinguished governors under the leadership of, distinguished Southerners, including two governors, Republican Linwood Holton of Virginia and Democrat William Winter of Mississippi, Juanita Krebs, Jim Batten, the CEO of Knight Ritter, Dr. Ed Bishop, who was then at the University of Houston, had been executive director of President Johnson's Commission on Rural Poverty, and we went out and took a look carefully at what was going on, and once again we found that the 90s, the late 80s were going to be more like 50s and 60s when millions left than they were the 70s when hundreds of thousands of them returned. But that this time the migration was going to be to the cities of the South rather than the cities of the North. The cities of the South were more prepared to assimilate undereducated, poor people, and most of them minorities, than were the cities of the North a generation ago. The report was called Shadows in the Sun Belt, and it struck a nerve and got a lot of national as well as an inordinate amount of regional attention. And coupled with the report Halfway Home and a Long Way to Go by the Commission on the Future of the South a few months later, which reinforced this, sort of put the rural South, I think, back on the map as far as needing public attention. But a large part of what I was doing came from the old urban days again, which is looking at what is being done to us, in addition to what can we do for the rural South. Can you just stop beating your wife? Can you stop beating your stepchild? These rural areas. For instance, the deregulation of transportation meant that trains and buses don't stop at small towns anymore. Airplane fares and trucking rates are exorbitantly expensive. The decline in money for infrastructure meant roads and bridges were inordinately hit in rural areas while interstate stayed in fairly good shape. The interstate banking meant that our money was migrating out of the rural South, what little there was, to not just to Charlotte or Atlanta, but to or even New York, but Frankfurt and Tokyo, where the return was the greatest. The end of revenue sharing meant support these smaller towns that were about to collapse anyway. I mean, their legs were cut out from under them. I'm not saying that any of these things by itself was all that important, but all of them taken together were just catastrophic to the rural South. And in the meantime, government had, because of tax cuts, had become impotent to do much about it. And by common consent, rural policy had always been an area of national concern rather than state concern. So what we spent a lot of time doing during the 80s were a failed attempt to get national rural policy to become something other than the sole sport of obscenely high commodity support programs and comprehend our problems in the South, which we failed to do, and which we and others succeeded to do, was to get states begin to fill the vacuum in policy making and programming. That so you have an awful lot more attention today to rural schools, rural small business, rural capital gaps than we did 10 years ago.
Did the decline of influence of southern rural legislators have something to do with this? I mean,
yeah, I think so. I'll give you another anecdotal example of that. One of the last of the most powerful, Senator Stennis of Mississippi, retired 2 years ago, and since that time, the Greenville, Mississippi, and the Delta International Airport looks like the Flying Dutchman. Boeing has closed up its facility there. Yeah, there's no doubt about the fact that rural Southern senators and congressmen, they didn't have a good feeling for all the people of the rural South. Certainly had a good feel for the economy of the rural South and knew how to help shore it up.
so we've lost that.
Well, you still got Jamie Whitten.
Yeah.
Oh, you still got a few.
At the same time that you're working on these economic development questions, you are there still is an emphasis on, particularly on young people again, and you do a major study at this time looking at risk youth. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, in the 70s, I didn't mention in response to your question, but one of an earlier question, but one of the directions the Concentrated Employment Training Act drew us in was to become a national organization rather than a regional organization. In the 80s, MDC was hurt, of course, badly, as all social program research organizations were, about changes in federal funding. And our grants and contracts, which had been 80% federally funded, were gone, almost completely wiped out. Today, I think 5 to 10% of our work is federally funded. The rest from foundations, some from state government. So just a complete turnaround. But at the time, the demand for our business sort of drove where we were going, perhaps more than a good, solid planning effort about where we ought to be going would have. But at any rate, we became, beginning in '76 with the National Youth Conference, an expert in youth unemployment. And to some extent, we have been in demand as experts, as a source of innovation and monitoring ever since. And our attention to youth has been steady, and it's the only part of our work that's still national. When we were struggling so much to stay alive, we were on half salaries in the early 80s and working more than full time, and had declined to a staff of 7 at one point. I asked for a review by the Ford Foundation of the value of this organization and what I felt was its institutional memory, because somebody's going to have to invest in us or we were going to have to give up the ghost. We had just enough money left to lock the doors, go home, and finish up the contracts and not owe anybody anything. Well, they did a long, big study of NBC and decided that we had value, but that we ought to withdraw back to our historic concern for the South. We'll take a heavy look at both economic development as well as workforce development. And we have done that, except that we have maintained this national focus on youth because old customers and friends have sort of demanded it, and that reputation and that capacity is still there.
Well, I think this has been terrific. I just have just a couple of questions, and I think it relates to the youth issue as well as other issues. But earlier you talked about, it's going to either be high skill employment or no employment, and as we look at ourselves and the economy, sort of entering the next century, with the global economy, less and less is being produced in this country, more and more is being produced overseas. And as I think it's somewhere in one of the articles, reports that you all wrote, you talked about the year 2000 and the kind of medium educational level for job entry will be 13.5 years of education. So it's kind of how does one begin to turn the country's imagination towards this very important task of preparing for this kind of economy in which we're not going to really be producing as much, but it's the person who can imagine, the person who can use the computers, the person who can regulate. Because I think we still imagine sort of, we're linked to American corporate life, and American corporate life produces things here, but in fact, we close 12 plants in North America and open up, GM and open up 3 or whatever it was in Houston. How do we begin to do this?
By the time we get to Greenville in the first weekend in June, is that it for your conference? I hope I'll be able to ask you a little better, because we are trying to answer that question now in a study that we're doing for the Pew Charitable Trust and the Department of Labor about describing the impact of the workforce crisis in the South for Southern governors and CEOs and the general public, and suggesting solutions to the crisis. And we put together another extraordinarily capable group, including, once again, Juanita Krebs and Ed Bishop and William Winter and Governor Holton and John Clendenin, who's CEO of Bell South, and Elridge McMillan, who's president of Southern Education Foundation, Congressman Espy of Mississippi, and Jim Johnston, the CEO of R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, another solid group to take a hard look at this question. And I don't know the answer to it. I should say this, though, that it's a fairly flip generalization for me to say high skills or no jobs, just as it's fairly flip generalization for the implication of Ray and Secretary Brock's report on the labor market to be low skills, low wages, as if we're all going to be employed by a series of hamburger joints and cooking French fries for each other. I mean, it's not as simple as that. Somewhere in between, we will be sorting out something of the truth, and some areas of the country are going to be doing better than others. And clearly, if present trends continue, urban areas are going to be doing a hell of a lot better than rural areas are, unless some kind of interventions are made. But yeah, I do follow your question. In the rural South, I hope very much for us to continue to have a profitable and solid textile and apparel sector of the economy. We got to employ fewer people, not more. We got to become more mechanized. And how we sort all of this out for an obviously confused electorate the day before Super Tuesday, 1992, as we sit around this room, how the presidential candidates, who obviously are not doing a terribly good job of sorting it out for the American electorate. It's a tough question. I think the implication in the question is the best answer.
Are you concerned at all? I think this is sort of a related question, George. At all with what appears to be kind of a growing disconnectedness between those people that do have a fair amount of wealth in this country and do have the skills and the capacities to imbue those skills to their children and get them in the right schools, and what appears to be a growing group of people that don't have those sorts of access, and at least what some people describe as the growing indifference
Yeah.
between
Yeah.
between the, I don't want to use the haves and the have-nots, but the people that may have more capacity to make it in the 21st century, and those that, and I think we certainly see that around Durham or Chapel Hill, where you can live in very nice neighborhoods and you pass through other neighborhoods where really the people that live there just seem to have been passed by this
Yeah.
research triangle and whatnot.
And it's worse in Detroit and Philadelphia.
Yeah, right.
And I mean, the social as well as the economic fallout is extraordinary. I mean, the term underclass is a despicable term in a country which is founded on the principle of equality, and it's also social and economic dynamite. I don't think, as we look at the economic future, we're going to be able to afford a growing underclass. I mean, in the 80s, we could write it off. We could spend it on welfare and write it off, but it's getting too big, and we're going to be in trouble economically. Obviously, it's going to blow up at some point, because democracy, by definition, can't afford those extremes. In Philadelphia, I was struck a year ago by the alienation between the races that I had never seen before in a city that 10 years earlier had been doing an extraordinary job of trying to overcome the divisions of race, and I thought it generally done a better job of it than most. But I had a drink with an old friend of mine who's been involved, a sort of crusading reporter who for the last 15 years has been involved in social programs, who's white, and says that he still lives in a transition neighborhood, as he calls it, which is a mixed neighborhood of blacks and whites. But the blacks and whites don't socialize anymore. They don't talk anymore. And in the taxi leaving town, I had a black taxi driver who, after finding out what my religion was and what I was doing up there, and saw that it had some concern for poverty, was asking me if I knew that Bush, having been in the CIA, had concocted this plot with Israel to destroy the black race through importing crack cocaine into the major cities. I mean, the division that you describe is extraordinary. I asked a foundation president friend of mine, what happened in a city like Philadelphia, and she said, hope ran out when guilt wore out. That is, that somehow or another, her friends, her contemporaries, stopped feeling guilty for what their piece of what society has done for its poor citizens, and it stopped hoping at approximately the same time. But those connections have got to be rebuilt, or obviously the American dream is at risk.
And I think somewhere now, just to follow up a little bit of that, I remember you wrote something to the effect that government has a hard time creating, say, leadership in this area. How do we kind of work together to solve these problems, because we have to get elected every 4 years, and business has to turn the profit and whatnot. I mean,
Yeah.
there's some of the realities of what is it going to take to I mean, you've been working on this for a long time, and if anyone's going to know anything, and it's going to be people like yourself. What does it take to create this? I mean, are we in a moral slump? Are we to refashion? One of the things that frightens me is the implications, I think, of the way that the economy is going. Is that people who are kind of making it don't really need. I mean, they've got their computers and their modems, and they take airplanes. They don't ride on roads, and we work in other countries. countries, and I'm wondering if we're not, in some ways, sort of kind of becoming this cosmopolitan disconnectedness or something.
All disembodied from each other. It's yeah. Can we? Yeah, I think there are two. I mean, you described two pieces to the question, and one is the public sector, and I don't know what you do about the political reality that politicians in office think in 2-year and 4-year increments, which means that long-term planning, as West Germany or Western Europe in general, excluding England and Japan, find routine. We don't do on the public sector side of the equation. And then, as you say, the stock watching mentality of that became was bad enough historically in this country, and then went crazy in the 80s of wanting an immediate return rather than a building a solid company for the long run. And if we don't get immediate return, then we're going to merge, and we're going to diversify, and we're going to shut things off, and in effect, eat our young as well as our old. I mean, it's, what we do about that private sector side of things, I really don't know. I mean, I don't know how businesses. It does seem to me that clearly there are changes in the 90s in a variety of ways. We have a whole lot more young folks that are looking for work here than we ever had in the 80s. I do think the cannibalism in the business world is slowed in the last three years or so. And I do think that business is being more strategic in how it takes its piece of the solution to societal problems than it once did. And that is, instead of writing a check to the United Way, you do have utility companies looking at the educational system and being very concerned how in the hell they're going to sell power, telephone time in the rural South or in the cities if we've got a soup kitchen workforce that can't afford it. So I do see a greater social consciousness, at least in this region, on the part of the industry sector. Whether that means the profit sector, though, is going to do anything about the short-term look at profits versus long-term investments, I don't know.
Just one other question. I'm always curious with people like yourself who have worked long and hard at these issues. What has sort of kept you going, or why do you do what you do?
Oh, I think it's the best of possible worlds for anybody who is motivated by achievement or change or progress or visible progress. Because, unlike and not terribly motivated by either money or security. And you can see that not in 3 years or 5 years, or especially in 2 years, as foundations like to invest, have something accomplished within that period of time, or by whim, as government generally chooses to invest in social programs. But in the nonprofit sector, there is the freedom that the profit sector has of innovation, and there is also the satisfaction that the public servant has in seeing something accomplished for people, or for your geography, or for whatever piece of turf you've invested in.
I wonder if one of the themes we're going to try to develop for this conference is trying to understand what's changed, what's different about Southern rural poverty today than 30 years ago.
And conversely, what remains the same?
And what remains the same. And I wonder if you could give us a little soundbite that we could use for helping us think about that and kind of planning, is how would you kind of evaluate where what's happened in trying to deal with this very serious issue that's that's as old as the South is?
Well, as an old, broken-down politician, or even as a current presidential candidate could tell you, for a 30-second soundbite, we need at least a week or two of solid creative work to come up with something that will play. But the biggest difference between rural poverty today and 30 years ago, number one, there's not as many rural poor because there's not as many rural people. And so many of them have gone. A major problem with that is that our rural areas, to some extent, look like fished out farm ponds, nothing left but bullheads and suckers. That was not my soundbite, but a friend who was chairman of the sociology department at NC State, rural sociologist, almost 30 years ago. That was his concern. And we did, if not lose our best and brightest, we lost an awful lot of our most adventurous, most entrepreneurial, and a lot of our smartest folks. Another difference in the rural South today and 20 years ago is that it's empty not just of people but of towns. And you fly across the Delta, as I did in Mississippi 3 months ago, and it really looks like one giant cotton patch punctuated with catfish farms. It's distressing. And it's distressing when you think about the extraordinary problems of the New York inner city, with which we are still familiar, both personally and MDC professionally, and in those schools and in Harlem recently. And any farmer knows if you crowd your chickens too close together, they peck each other to death. That's not healthy, and neither is it healthy to have this great expanses of the most productive land and the finest natural resources emptied of people who can tend them.